Thank you, Madam President. So, as I mentioned in committee of the whole, I am entirely in favor of increasing the occupancy limits. Increasing the occupancy limits for a building that can handle increased occupancy, which means that it is habitable, it has proper lighting, the square footage of each individual bedroom is adequate. If we make sure that those factors are in place, and we will, then I am fully in favor of increasing the occupancy limits. It's a mechanism to improve affordable housing and to increase affordable housing in our city. I think it specifically helps young people, people of color, renters. I think it improves the affordability of several of these, both single-family homes as well as duplexes, and it makes a whole lot of sense. What I am adamantly opposed to, and the more I research and read up on this, I am even more opposed to it, is items C1 through 5. And here's why. First, if we are going to be enforcing these items, I think it will be an absolute mess. I think it's wrong. I think it's potentially regressive. And I think they could ultimately be enforced in a biased manner. This is not the kind of thing that I believe that we should be moving forward with as a city. It potentially even violates our sanctuary city status. I mean, we're talking about looking at people's voter registration, their driver's licenses for identification purposes, their motor vehicle registration, their tax documents. We actually have this in the ordinance. So if we are indeed enforcing these pieces, then I am adamantly opposed to it. If we're not enforcing these pieces, and I've heard people say both, I've heard staff say that we will be enforcing it, I've heard authors say that we won't be enforcing it, I'm not really clear exactly where it is. If we aren't going to be enforcing it, then it should be removed. Nothing undermines government more than passing legislation that won't be enforced, and that appears to be what we're doing. And for purposes of enforcement, I just don't think these are items that we should be getting involved with. The regulation of intentional community, I've heard a lot of people say that, well, we want to allow like-minded people to live together. I don't really care if people are like-minded or not like-minded. And I don't think that that's something that we should be looking into. I don't care what their views are. I don't care what their statuses are. This is not something that we as a city should be involved with. And if we're not going to be involved with it, let's stay out of the picture. I probably will have additional comments, but I'll leave it there for now.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm strongly in support of this motion. I had indicated at zoning and planning that I may bring a substitute motion that would, instead of taking this approach to intentional communities, just take the other approach that staff had recommended, which was redefining family to allow for 8 unrelated individuals to live together. And that's an approach that more cities have taken as they, again, it's very rare for cities to have the regulation of occupancy in their zoning codes. Most cities regulate it as a life safety issue. And so we are one of the few that excludes people based on occupancy in our zoning code. I think that people have pointed out that really deserves its own process, and I agree, so I won't be making that motion, but I think at the very least that this council should not support the kind of language that is in this housing code. Councilmember Frey outlined the things, but even reading them out loud makes me feel ridiculous to say that the city of Minneapolis would regulate the democratic governance of a household, its maintenance responsibilities, and other household issues, that we would have the amount of overreach it would take to check on people's voter registration to decide where they get to live. The assumptions that this make are troubling to me. And as I said in committee of the whole, I think it assumes that only some kinds of people should be able to live together in our city and that other kinds of people should not. And I don't think that we should support that as a council. So again, at the very least, I think we should remove this language that goes so very far over the stretch of what I think our city government should be regulating about how people live together.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam President. So I will be voting in favor of this item today, and I want to thank Councilmembers Frey and Bender for bringing up this conversation. And I've reached out to both Councilmember Goodman and Councilmember Gordon about my stance on this issue. And mostly, I just wanted to speak to the ID requirements. And so one thing I had shared with Councilmember Frey earlier is, when we're talking about sort of how to connect our regulatory arms to sort of the place-based registration of people or identification of people, I want us to think a little bit more broadly, particularly because the immigrant community, specifically the undocumented immigrant community, won't have access to driver's licenses. Right now, the state of Minnesota bars any undocumented immigrant from having access to a driver's license. That was a change that happened under Governor Pawlenty, and ever since then, the community has mobilized for years to try to change that. And it's one of the agenda items that we actually support on our lobbyist agenda through the Intergovernmental Relations Department. So when we're talking about IDs, I wanted us to be more flexible and just think about ways that maybe, we could have built in something about like library cards or gym memberships, or, for example, the Mexican consulate issues matriculas consulares, which are these IDs that the Mexican government gives Mexican nationals and their offices in St. Paul. And many people have opted to get that form of identification because some police departments, like in Worthington, actually accept that as an official form of ID in order to avoid the immigration enforcement conversation, which we know has a lot of our communities in this shroud of fear. So I just wanted to say that I appreciate all the work the authors have led on this. I am very supportive of the initiative overall, and I hope that this small change doesn't affect the overall intent and impact of the policy. I actually think it doesn't. So this is why I'm going to be supporting this motion today. Thank you.
Councilmember Glidden.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I've actually been kind of wavering back and forth on this. Part of the challenge I feel is that I wish that the motion had been a little bit more specifically tailored to take out the elements that Councilmember Frey thought were most objectionable. And part of the challenge is it's a little bit of the difference between, is someone really trying to get around our codes, some of which are there for the safety of residents, and operate something that really isn't about a household trying to figure out how to live together, but it's more like a rooming house or other things like that. And quite honestly, that I've had experiences with those kinds of things happening in my ward. I know others have as well. Some of the items in here that I thought were more important to showing that intention were items 4 and 5. I could see items 3 and 2 being ones that could be removed and still allow some sort of a factor test to allow. So anyway, I'll just say that I will be supporting this motion, but I don't know if it's going to carry. I'll just say I think Councilmember Frey that I wish you would have tailored it a little bit more to take out those items that seemed a little bit more difficult to enforce or objectionable.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate having this discussion, and it's interesting how the council maybe changes over time and opinions about this. I'm definitely supporting the original motion that was brought forward in large part because those were things that got worked out in a larger community process. But also, I think there's some misleading information about what's required and what isn't required. Partly, these things were these factors that shall be considered were written down so that we would have a definition, so that people who wanted to be functioning as some kind of a family together in a house knew what kind of standards would mean that. This is essentially the definition so that we have some guidance, both for the people that want to form a household like this and live like this so they understand what it means, and those that don't. Basically, the idea was if you're going to function as a housekeeping unit, then you should get to do that and you can exceed the maximum occupancy codes. But they were also stipulated in here because people have lots of concerns about how people might use this in a variety of different ways. So they set some standards. I also want to be really clear that there's not requirements. No one is going to be required to provide their driver's license if they don't want to. We are just saying that we're interested if this is somebody's permanent address, and then we give them some options for how they could demonstrate that, or to themselves or to somebody else if they so choose. We will not be looking at any driver's license for those purposes. We will be accepting a registration when people tell us that they meet those standards, and then they make a commitment and they sign off, say, yep, we feel like we meet these basic standards and these considerations. We're an intentional community. Would you please allow us to live as one? And only even when there's a problem would we have to get in the way. And problems do arise, and we heard scenarios all over the place about what if people do this, what if people do that? They're going to use this for that. People are worried and they're concerned about it. So this is a way that we can provide some cushioning and some safeguards. I think what will happen is we will have people trying this out in a variety of different ways, and we'll find out that, this isn't a big problem. And if there are problems that arise, if we have the ordinance as written before us, then we'll have the tools that we need to address those.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out that a lot of the things that are also about restricting the use of these is also under D. And so I think that removing C still leaves quite a lot of regulation, including a very specific one, D1, which says a dwelling unit in which the various occupants act as separate roomers may not be deemed to be occupied by an intentional community. So that is very explicit in saying that people who live as boarders cannot be an intentional community. Item D2 talks about one owner cannot have more than one of these. There is a section that talks about who else can own the property that would be an intentional community. So there's quite a lot of restrictions beyond what would be struck out of C that I think are sufficient to ensure that these are not boarding houses, which again were made illegal in Minneapolis in the 90s, and quite a lot more restrictions on who gets to be and own an intentional community. So removing C just talks about what's happening within the walls of the home. Again, in my opinion, very, very significant overreach, as well as some of these, I think, troubling language about identification. So I don't know. Item 4 talks about how long you must live in the home. I personally think that's troubling as well, but I think there's some of these that are more egregious than others. But again, a lot of the issues that I think are covered in here are also in D.
Councilmember Gordon.
So one thing that I would suggest and a commitment I would make, especially if we move forward with it as it's written now, so that we can try implementing this, is to ask staff and others to come back in a year so that we can get a full review of this and we can look at it. And certainly at that point, then we can look at, well, how did these factors under C, how did they play or how did they not play into that? Were there instances where somehow some group was prohibited from doing this or not? So I would definitely be open to staff direction that would require that and do a thoughtful review. And that might also give us time as a council then to come back and look at possible changes and amendments if we gave this a year to move forward. And I would greatly appreciate that and consideration of that from my colleagues here.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There has been a lot of community input on this process. Councilmember Gordon conducted 2 or 3 community meetings. I've talked about it in every neighborhood meeting that I go to on a monthly basis. There's been a lot of public feedback, and this was crafted in a way that would allow intentional communities to be defined as such. I've learned a lot about what actual intentional communities are, or co-ops. They have a definition, and having us not have a definition in our code is essentially eliminating the occupancy rule. It's pretty simple. If you don't define what an intentional community is, and you're saying it's just for the purposes of intentional communities, a family of 2 or more unrelated adults, then you're eliminating the occupancy rule. It's simple. you have to have a definition. And so I understand where Councilmember Cano is coming from with regard to the issue of driver's licenses specifically, and perhaps there would be some change in that area if there was a concern, legitimate or not. None of the things that people have concerns about with regard to immigration at this point are illegitimate because there's no idea of what's going to happen. But in the end, if you don't have a definition, the definition is essentially anything goes as long as it's two people or more who are unrelated living together and calling themselves an intentional community. And the outcome of that is the elimination of the occupancy requirement, which is not what the community process was in order to allow intentional communities. And my fear is I was out there telling my constituents what this was. And now it sounds like Councilmember Frey wants to tell my constituents this is what it's going to be without getting any feedback from anyone at any meeting at any time. I'm not sure that you attended any of these meetings, any neighborhood meetings. I don't know that you brought it up at any of your neighborhood meetings or asked anyone what they thought or felt about eliminating the occupancy requirement. You and others on the council might be there, but the rest of the community is not. And there have been many incidences where people have said, well, we're going to let 7, 8, 9 people live in our house who are unrelated because they have issues or problems, they're friends, and they don't meet the occupancy requirement, and we don't allow it. This is an elimination of the occupancy requirement. To eliminate the definition is saying we're just opening it up. That's why Councilmember Frey feels so strongly about it, because he wants to eliminate the occupancy requirement. He said that. Mm-hmm. And while you might be there, the community is not, and we owe it to the community to tell them, this is what we're thinking about doing. What is your public feedback? Because if there was public feedback right now about eliminating the occupancy requirement, this room would be filled with people. So I don't think I know more than everybody else does. I think it's our job to tell our constituents, this is what we're thinking, and get feedback. And we got feedback. Councilmember Gordon got feedback. I've been out in the community working on this, so has he, and we heard we don't want to eliminate the occupancy requirement. This is a backdoor way to do that.
Councilmember Frey.
Thank you, Madam President. So if this is a backdoor way to do it, then I would emphasize that we simply need to be honest in our ordinance. These are supposedly items that are extremely important to the community, and I don't disagree with that. And no, I did not attend all of the community meetings in either Ward 7 or Ward 2. However, these are items that people supposedly think that are important, but we literally have testimony here today that these items won't be enforced. So you can't have it both ways. Either they're important to the community and we're going to enforce these items, or they're not important to the community and we won't be enforcing them. And there's still definitions in here. There's still requirements that go along with being an intentional community, as Councilmember Bender pointed out. Items D1, a dwelling unit in which the various occupants act as separate roomers may not be deemed occupied by an intentional community. Additionally, we are required to submit a formal permitting, going through a formal permitting process, and you're required to have a notarized contract that works out with the staff. There has to be an inspector that comes in at the very beginning to ensure that the conditions are habitable, that the square footage is adequate. We do have pieces in place right now to make sure that this is done properly. My ask is to not have items in here that we're not going to be enforcing. I did, Councilmember Glidden, I appreciate your comments. I did tailor this specifically to the items that I did not like, and I don't like items 1 through 5. We still have protections all through D. I would encourage people to read D. There is still an intentional community boilerplate that people have to go through. But I think we need to be very clear about what is in this ordinance and what is not in this ordinance.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, I will speak. I won't be supporting this today. I will tell you the feedback that I got from my constituents about this whole idea was, are you crazy? We live with a marketplace in challenged communities that people figure out ways to get around the rules. And I have dealt over the years with nuisance properties. We've got a whole committee that meets once a month to deal with nuisance properties, and part of the occasional things that happen are over occupancy. And I think not having rules is a huge mistake. And I realize that the challenge for enforcement for this may be great, but at least it has a process. It requires people to think about what they're doing. I think Councilmember Gordon's idea of putting this in place and then seeing what the outcomes are is a step that I think makes sense. But just to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to me, is a mistake. The other thing I will say is there are frequently cases when our housing inspectors have to ask for identification of who is living in a house. That's just part of their job. So whether it's a driver's license, some sort of utility bill, whatever, that's a routine question that is asked in trying to deal with some of the problems we have with housing in challenged communities. So I fail to understand why this is a problem. And if you don't have rules, it's the Wild West. And the Wild West ends up being in the most challenged neighborhoods. I'm not even comfortable with the idea that landlords can only have one intentional community. You think they're the people that we deal with all the time aren't smart enough to figure out how to have another LLC or a partner or to figure out how to get around your one rule? Come on. We live through this all the time, so I won't be supporting this today. Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, clerk call the roll, and I think we'll do a roll call because it looks like it's closely divided.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Aye.
Gordon.
No.
Cano.
Aye.
Reich.
No.
Bender.
Aye.
Glidden.
Aye.
Yang.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Quincy.
Nay.
I'm sorry, Councilmember
Nay.
Quincy? Nay.
No.
Forsami.
No.
Goodman.
No.
Frey.
Aye.
President Johnson.
No,
There are 7 ayes and 6 nays.
that amendment passes. Then on the main motion, any further discussion? Anyone care to speak? Seeing none, clerk call the roll on the main motion on item 23 as amended.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Cano.
Aye.
Reich.
Aye.
Bender.
Aye.
Glidden.
Aye.
Yang.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Quincy.
Aye.
Forsami.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Frey.
Aye.
President Johnson.
No,
There are 12 ayes and 1 nay.
that item is adopted.